There was a small wooden box sitting on the edge of my father's desk in the legal archives, held shut by a brass latch that had grown dull with 40 years of dust. For 22 years, I never raised the lid. The wood was a dark, polished mahogany, scratched at the corners, smelling faintly of lemon oil and the dry, brittle scent of aging paper. My name is Clara Vance. I am 34 years old now, living in Chicago, working as a senior archivist for the Municipal Records Department. I spend my days categorizing the past, placing dates and names into acid-free folders, ensuring that history is neatly contained. But in the spring of my 12th year, in a quiet, tree-lined suburb just outside Philadelphia, my own history was shattered and rebuilt over the course of a single, silent night. My parents disappeared between midnight and dawn. They left no note for the police. They left no unpaid debts that anyone could find, no packed suitcases, and no trail. The only thing they left was a grocery receipt taped to the kitchen counter next to a ceramic bowl of green apples. On the back of the receipt, written in my father's precise, drafting hand script, were 3 sentences: the mortgage is paid through the month, the back door lock sticks when it rains. And then, the final line, underlined once: do not follow us. The boundary that governed the rest of my life was not set by the local police, who spent weeks sweeping the house for clues, nor by the courts, who eventually had to declare my parents absent. It was set by a man named Arthur Hayes, a silent, immovable presence who stepped into the hollow space they left behind, guarding me from a distance, while making sure we never, not even once, spoke about why he stayed or what he had promised them before they vanished. I should start with how it began, because the order matters. If you scramble the timeline, you miss the quiet, heavy weight of how a life actually gets built in the margins of someone else's silence. It was October when they went missing. The house was left perfectly intact, a museum of a Tuesday evening abruptly paused. The kettle was still sitting on the back burner. The morning paper remained wrapped in its plastic sleeve on the porch. My mother's gardening gloves were damp on the mudroom shelf, carrying the smell of wet soil and crushed geraniums. When the local authorities finally realized they weren't dealing with a typical missing persons case, the quiet panic began to settle into the walls of the house. Social workers arrived with clipboards and sympathetic, tilted heads. That was when Arthur arrived. He was 38 at the time, an estate attorney who had worked in the same firm where my father served as a senior legal researcher. He was tall, soft-spoken, with broad shoulders that always seemed slightly hunched, as if he were perpetually trying to minimize his stature in a room. His eyes were the color of rain on asphalt, gray, steady, and entirely unreadable. He walked into our living room carrying a battered leather briefcase. He didn't offer grand promises or tearful comfort to me, a bewildered 12-year-old sitting on the stairs. He simply sat at our dining table, took out a silver fountain pen, and informed the state representative that my father had assigned him legal guardianship in the event of an unforeseen absence. He produced a heavily notarized trust document that covered my tuition, my housing, and my care until my 25th birthday. In those early months, our routine formed around the edges of absolute necessity. Arthur did not move into the house. That would have felt like an intrusion neither of us could bear. Instead, he arranged for my mother's sister, my Aunt Helen, to stay in the guest room during the week. Arthur himself visited every Tuesday and Thursday evening at precisely 6 o'clock to review the trust expenses, sign my school permission slips, and check on the house's maintenance. He would sit at the far end of the long dining table, unrolling blue architectural drafts or thick legal briefs, while I sat at the exact opposite end doing my middle school algebra. The space between us across that mahogany table was exactly 8 feet of polished wood, but it felt like an island sanctuary. He brought a small brass desk clock with him every time he came, a habit from his office, and placed it near his right elbow. The steady, rhythmic ticking of that clock became the heartbeat of my adolescence. "How was the geometry exam, Clara?" he would ask, his voice never rising above a calm baritone, his eyes fixed on a zoning document. "Fine, I think I got the final proof right," I would answer, my pencil scratching against the graph paper. "Good. Accuracy is just a matter of patience." He never asked if I missed them. He never brought up the ongoing, fruitless police investigation. He simply remained there, a human anchor in a world that had suddenly lost its gravity. As the years drifted on and I transitioned from a quiet, observant girl into a young woman working toward her master's degree in archival science, the nature of those visits evolved. The geography changed, but the boundaries never shifted by a fraction of an inch. By my mid-20s, I had taken a position at the City Archives, a cavernous, marble-floored building downtown where Arthur's law firm frequently cross-referenced historical land titles. Our professional orbits overlapped naturally, seamlessly. I became the specific researcher he requested when complex historical conveyances were needed. Every Thursday at 1 o'clock, he would walk into the reading room. He always wore a wool overcoat in the winter and a sharply pressed suit in the summer. He would carry 2 paper cups of black coffee from the shop around the corner. He would lay one on my desk, always placing it meticulously on a cork coaster so it wouldn't leave a water ring on the oak finish. We would then spend exactly 45 minutes discussing land deeds, probate records, and city maps. The tension between us was never sharp or explosive. It was a slow, deep current that ran beneath every mundane interaction. It lived in the way his hand would linger for a fraction of a second when passing a heavy, leather-bound ledger across the table. It lived in the way his eyes would track my movement across the quiet library floor when he thought I was absorbed in cataloging a fragile piece of vellum. There was an unspoken language in those micro-moments, a vocabulary of withheld breath and carefully measured distance. Once, during a severe rainstorm in late October, just after I had turned 26, we were trapped inside the basement vault long after the main office had closed. We were waiting for the maintenance team to repair a jammed security door. The room was dim, illuminated only by the warm amber light of a single brass desk lamp. Outside, the rain lashed violently against the narrow ground-level windows. We sat on metal folding chairs near the blueprint racks. The silence was thick, heavy with everything we had spent 14 years ignoring. He looked at me, his fingers resting on the armrest of his chair, just inches from my own hand. For a moment, his breathing hitched. He reached out, his hand moving so slowly it seemed to belong to a dream. His thumb gently caught a stray lock of hair that had fallen across my cheek, tucking it behind my ear. His touch was so faint it felt like a draft of cool air. He didn't pull away immediately. His fingers rested against the jawline just below my ear for 3 long, deafening heartbeats. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The air in the room felt pulled taut, like a piano wire stretched to its absolute breaking point. I could smell the rain on his coat, the faint trace of his shaving soap, the dust of the archives. Then, very deliberately, he withdrew his hand, placed both palms flat on his knees, adjusted his tie, and looked back toward the heavy steel door. "They should have the mechanism bypassed shortly," he said, his voice entirely flat. "Yes," I replied, staring at my hands. "I'm sure they will." Neither of us ever said a word about it again. People around us noticed, of course. You cannot exist in proximity to someone for over a decade with that kind of quiet electric pull without others sensing the atmospheric pressure. My colleague, Marion, who worked the desk adjacent to mine, stopped me near the break room sink one afternoon after Arthur had left. She leaned against the counter, watching me carefully as I wiped down the coffee mugs. "He doesn't look at those property deeds, you know," she said quietly. "Mr. Hayes is extremely thorough," I replied, scrubbing a stubborn coffee stain. "Clara," she said, her voice softening, "he looks at you the way a man looks at a rare manuscript he knows he can never ever afford to buy. Is there something going on there?" I deflected, keeping my voice light and strictly professional. I told her that Arthur was simply an old family friend who took his duties as a former guardian very seriously. But inside, my mind was a maze of private theories. I spent nights in my apartment staring at the ceiling, wondering if his devotion was rooted entirely in an old, ironclad obligation to my father, or if it had quietly transformed into something else, something he fought against every single day out of a sense of moral duty or self-preservation. The obstacle between us was never a villain, nor was it a sudden crisis. It was a structure built of honor, propriety, and the heavy burden of age and position. Arthur was 14 years older than me. He was a senior partner at a highly conservative legal firm, a man whose entire life was predicated on ethics, boundaries, and the scrupulous management of other people's lives and trusts. To cross the line with me, to allow the relationship to shift from guardian and charge, from mentor and assistant, into something romantic, would have dismantled his entire moral architecture. He had given his word to my father before my parents vanished, a promise that had been formalized in court documents. To break that boundary would mean admitting that his care for me had been compromised. We both knew this, even without articulating it. The silence was the only thing keeping the foundation intact. The one time the boundary was truly, painfully tested was on my 28th birthday. He had taken me to a small, low-lit restaurant off the main square to mark the occasion. The snow was falling outside, catching the light of the street lamps. At the end of the dinner, while the waiter cleared our dessert plates, Arthur handed me a small, beautifully wrapped package. Inside was an antique silver bookmark, heavy and cool to the touch, engraved with my initials. As I reached to take it from the velvet box, my fingers brushed his. The sheer weight of years of unspoken longing seemed to collapse into that tiny charged space between our hands. I looked up at him, my eyes asking the question I had never been brave enough to voice. "Why are you still here? Why do you look at me like that?" He looked back at me. His expression, usually so guarded and serene, was caught in a moment of sheer, raw vulnerability that broke my heart. The gray of his eyes darkened. For 5 seconds, the rest of the restaurant faded away. Then, he slowly pulled his hand back, swallowed hard, and picked up his water glass. "The roads are getting worse," he said quietly, effectively drawing the curtain back over the window he had accidentally left open. "I should get you home." Time passed, as it always does, eroding the sharp edges of expectations. When I turned 30, I was offered a senior promotion that required me to relocate to the main municipal archival branch in Chicago. The move meant leaving behind the weekly Thursday lunches, the shared silence in the reading room, and the familiar sight of his charcoal raincoat hanging on the rack by the library entrance. On my last day in Philadelphia, he met me at the train station. He stood on the platform, his hands deep in his coat pockets, the wind ruffling his hair. "Chicago has a fine historical department," he said. "It does," I replied. He nodded slowly. "You'll do well there, Clara. You always do well." He didn't hug me. He extended his hand, and we shook, a firm, professional grip that felt like a door locking shut. Our contact shifted to formal correspondence after that. Brief, polite letters exchanged every few months regarding the final dissolution of the family trust, which was now fully settled, and occasional birthday cards written in his neat, unhurried script. I convinced myself during those 4 years in Chicago that what we had shared was simply a prolonged, beautiful shadow, a psychological coping mechanism for two lonely people bound together by an unresolved mystery. I told myself that his restraint was proof of a lack of deeper feeling, that he had viewed me merely as a project he was duty-bound to complete. It was easier to believe he was just a good, distant man than to believe he was a man quietly breaking his own heart for my sake. Then, 6 months ago, I received a phone call from a law clerk in Philadelphia. Arthur had suffered a sudden, severe stroke while working at his desk. He had passed away peacefully 2 days later. He had never married, had no living relatives, and had named me as the sole executor of his personal estate. I returned to Philadelphia on a gray, drizzly Tuesday in November. Entering his office at the firm was like stepping back in time, the scent of cedar oil, old paper, and his familiar pipe tobacco still hung heavily in the air. The leather chair was pushed back, just as he had left it. Sitting on the center of his desk was the small brass clock that had marked the evenings of my childhood, its pendulum now quiet and still. And sitting next to it was the wooden box from my father's old legal archives, the one I had seen decades ago but never dared open. Beside the box lay a heavy envelope addressed to me in Arthur's hand, dated 3 weeks before his death, as if his body had known its time was coming to an end. Inside the box were dozens of neatly organized manila envelopes, dated sequentially from the week my parents disappeared up until the month of my 30th birthday. They were not love letters. They were not journals of hidden passion. They were financial receipts, bank statements, encrypted wire transfers, and private investigator reports. As I read through them, sitting in his leather chair, the truth of my life opened up like a heavy iron door swinging wide. My parents had not simply run away. They had not abandoned me out of neglect or fear of parenthood. My father, in his capacity as a legal researcher, had uncovered and documented a catastrophic financial fraud scheme orchestrated by immensely powerful men in the city. When he threatened to turn state's evidence, those men had threatened his family. To protect me, my parents had fled into deep cover witness protection. But the state could not guarantee my safety if I went with them. Bringing a 12-year-old girl would draw immediate, trackable attention. Arthur, who was merely a junior associate at the time, had stepped into the breach. He had voluntarily taken on the entire burden of my protection. The documents laid everything bare. Arthur had personally bought out my father's immense, fabricated debts using his own family inheritance, paying off predatory creditors in secret so that no one would ever come looking for me. But it was more than just money. Every single month, for 22 years, Arthur had driven 3 hours in the dead of night to a remote drop box in upstate New York. He delivered detailed, handwritten reports about my growth, my progress, my health, and my academic achievements to a middleman, who then passed them to my parents in hiding. He had acted as the living, breathing bridge between us, absorbing all the physical risk, enduring the crushing silence, and maintaining the boundary so that my parents' location would never be compromised by a trace or a slip of the tongue. He had denied himself the comfort of telling me the truth, letting me believe I was abandoned. And he had denied himself the right to love me as anything other than a guardian, because any shift in our relationship, any romantic entanglement, would have drawn intense personal and financial scrutiny, risking the very structure keeping me alive. I sat in his empty office for hours as the twilight faded into deep night, holding those yellowed receipts and handwritten notes. The recalibration of my entire life's memory was physically overwhelming. Every look, every quiet gesture, every moment of restraint that I had interpreted as hesitation or professional detachment had actually been an act of monumental, enduring love and ironclad discipline. The rainstorm in the vault. The silver bookmark. The goodbye at the train station. He hadn't been pushing me away. He had been holding the roof up, choosing to be viewed as distant, cold, or emotionally unavailable, rather than endanger the quiet life he had sacrificed his own future to build for me. The next afternoon, I met with the retired private investigator whose name had appeared on the earliest reports, a man named Thomas Vance, no relation to me, who had been Arthur's silent partner in managing the drop-offs. We met in a small diner near the train station. The rain beat softly against the glass. Thomas was in his 70s now, with silver hair and hands that trembled slightly as he lifted his black tea. He looked at me for a long time before he spoke, his eyes mapping the features of the girl he had only read about in Arthur's files. He didn't offer grand emotional speeches. He simply confirmed what the papers showed. Arthur refused every promotion that would have required him to move out of the state, Thomas said softly, setting his cup down. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment. He funneled almost all of his private wealth into maintaining the security apparatus, the shell corporations, and the trust fund that paid for your life. Why didn't he tell me? My voice cracked, just slightly. Because he loved your parents, Thomas said. And because he cared for you more than he cared for his own life. But he knew that the moment he treated you like anything other than a responsibility, the moment he let himself cross that line, he would lose the objective distance he needed to keep you safe. He chose to be the wall between you and the storm. A wall doesn't get to hold you, Clara, it just keeps the wind off. The truth was finally named aloud, plainly, without dramatic outbursts or romantic melodrama. The restraint held, even in the telling, even in the diner with a stranger. What broke was not the boundary Arthur had spent his life defending, but my own long-standing misunderstanding of his silence. His quietness had not been emptiness, it had been a fortress. I returned to Chicago 3 days later, carrying only the small brass desk clock and the heavy wooden box. I did not attempt to track down my parents. The time for that had long since passed, and the structures of their hidden lives were built on terrifying choices made decades ago that I had no right to disturb. To look for them now would be to undo Arthur's life's work. Instead, I placed the brass clock on my own desk at the municipal archives. Every morning, when I sit down to begin my work, sorting through the remnants of other people's histories, I wind the small key at the back of the clock. I listen to the steady, reassuring tick that accompanied my algebra homework 20 years ago. The restraint that governed Arthur's life became his ultimate final gift to me. It was a love so refined and unselfish that it required no recognition, no reward, and no physical fulfillment to exist in its purest form. Some people show devotion through grand declarations and highly visible sacrifices. But others build a quiet, invisible ceiling over your head to keep the rain off. And they die, never bothering to tell you who built it. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.